Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Good to have you with us. If you're looking for the message that had to do with the last Sunday in April, there wasn't one. I was on vacation. So thankful for those that filled in during my absence. We're dealing with kind of a difficult passage. Not that I can't figure out what it says, but um, difficult from the standpoint that it's sad to hear what I have to say. And we are very much in the thick of these things when it comes to dealing with rebellious men, false teachers, people that are teaching incorrectly in the Bible to the people, and people who want to hear that sort of thing. And so we are in the day and age when it says, preach the word in season and out of season. We are in an out of season time, my friends, and people are leaving Bible preaching churches because they want a softer message. They want a message that supports the homosexual agenda, is very liberal, and these churches are growing, but it's going to be like a big puffball, and then they're going to collapse on themselves because of their false teaching. I don't want to say any specific church because there are some that are good and some that are not. But you have to have discernment. And so that's why you need to be listening for this message for yourself. Because it's not up just to your preacher. It's up to you. And if your church splits over the homosexual agenda and the majority of the people want to stay there that hold the homosexual agenda, you're going to have to leave. And if your majority of your church wants to hold to the truth that there shouldn't be homosexual marriage, and you know what a male is, and you know what a female is between a man and a woman, and you're the majority, you'd have to make the other group leave. Otherwise, it'll just stay as an infection in your group. Tough stuff. And it's happening right now. We've had churches just down the road that have had to split, and denominations, they had to leave, otherwise they'd lose their building. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It's very upsetting. And this is a no holds barred. You're fighting for something right now. And the truth of the matter is, they've been fighting in one manner or another ever since the beginning of the first century. If you think of the church as a pack of caribou or reindeer, the wolves are always nipping at the edges, looking for the weak, looking for the old, looking for the very young to pick them off. And there's always has to be a constant battle to survive. So we come to Titus chapter 1 and verse 10, and it says, for there are many rebellious men, empty talkers, and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach for the sake of sordid gain. My friends, we still have that. We will always have that until the church is raptured and the ones that are true believers are taken out of the world. The church on the earth will be less pure. So Paul makes an alarming statement there in verse 10 of chapter 1. And like I said, that happened 2,000 years ago when this was written, but it's still continuing on. And those that think that it's not happening are the vulnerable ones. You tell your daughters, don't be going shopping in the middle of the night at some store. Be careful where you're going. And they blow that off, and then something bad happens to them. There has to be an awareness in the people of the church that there is always this danger. We've had sad things happen to this church where we've had to have one person leave or another because they went down a wrong path. We couldn't let them teach anymore. And although that painful as that is, it's worse if you continue to let them teach. And so, my friends, it's not a laughing matter. So this is in the context of having proper leaders, and there are many false teachers. It takes a long time to develop a man into teaching properly. And if you notice here, it says in verse 12, one of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. Well, that's pretty outlandish. I mean, I'm sure there's some truth tellers on the Isle of Crete, but for the most part, they have a culture that by and large was a lying culture. There was even a statement to Cretanize. Cretanize meant that you were a liar. And so the island was known for people just not telling the truth. Just as there was honor among the thieves, there probably was honor among the Cretans themselves. But when it came to outsiders and stuff, they would lie to you as soon as tell the truth. And so there was this culture of disrespect for the truth, lying, and the prophet. Well, he was actually a writer who said this. His name was Epimenides. I can do better. Epimenides. I think that's pretty close. Epimenides. He wrote this in 6th century BC. That's 600 years before Christ. And here is Paul writing approximately 60 AD, and he is saying it's still true. That is unfortunate. So here's a culture that they were going into to start churches, and the culture was a culture that had this bend to them. And the idea was that you had to rebuke them sharply and to get this put out of the church. Now, sometimes you'd have to put somebody out of the church, and more often than not, you preach the truth, and the people would sanitize themselves and get rid of that attribute. And, when we do missionary work in some of these unreached peoples groups, they're full of idolatry and superstition. And when you get them saved, they have to set this aside. And so cultures have to be sanitized by the church that it's in, and the church has to influence the culture and not the culture the church. So Paul was saying this is the prevailing culture of the Isle of Crete, but we cannot go along with that to get along. Now, my friends, just to make an application to today, some 2,000 years later, we have a culture that seems to start prevailing in the United States of America. And it has infected the churches. And instead of the churches sanitizing the culture is influencing the churches. In the 1960s, little church history lesson, in the 1960s, one half of Protestant denominations were mainline denominations. There were 7 of them. The United Methodist Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church, Presbyterian Church USA, and a host of others. And I was in one of those in the 1960s. I was a boy. 1960, I was just 10 years old. And by the 1970s, early 1970s, I saw the handwriting on the wall, if you will, and I decided I had to leave that denomination. And I went into a Bible preaching church, happened to be the Worthington Grace Brethren Church in Columbus, Ohio, Worthington, Ohio. And there was starting to be a mass migration away from the mainline churches. They weren't holding to the truth. And then what happened was that these mainline denominations began to be influenced by the prevailing culture, and they were taking a stand to allow homosexual preachers, women teachers, preachers, homosexual marriages, and then they got the upper hand, and pretty soon many of these denominations had to split. And it ended up that the prevailing culture seems to be in those churches that they're all for homosexual marriage. In the roughly 2/3 of the mainline Protestants now support same-sex marriages, according to a 2019 Pew Research Center survey. This is an article I have in the World magazine, and that was the October edition, 2023. It starts out, the push to accept homosexuality gutted traditional Protestantism. Evangelical churches are headed down the same road. Evangelical churches are more fundamental churches, and these churches are starting to go soft. That's the group I'm in. And lest anybody be comforted, now the church historian Thomas Kidd argues that evangelical churches, including non-denominational congregations, have become the new mainline. They're the big churches in the South and the Midwest now. Between 2010 and 2020, non-denominational churches added 9,000 congregations. That's quite a bit. And 2 million attendees, according to the 2020 U.S. Religious Census. Now, non-denominational churches represent the nation's third largest religious group after Catholic and churches affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention. But the problem with non-denominational churches, part of the appeal of non-denominational churches is that they carry less institutional baggage, statements of faith and things. But many emphasize individualism and lack theological accountability, making it easier for church leaders to adopt changes cultural message, such as those about sexuality and gender. And my friends, that's happening. And so these people that will leave the evangelical churches and the fundamental churches and go to non-denominational churches, they even have less protection now. And those groups are going to go the way of the mainline churches pretty soon and become overtaken by the homosexual agenda. Tough stuff. And so, on the one hand, we don't want to go along to get along. Lines must be drawn in proper places. And I say proper places. On the one hand, we don't want to be Amish. Here we are in the 20th century, 21st century, and we don't want to dress like the Amish and drive buggies and horses. There's some romantic aspects about that. It's not totally unappealing, but on the other hand, they draw lines in some pretty silly places. And so they have basically dropped out of society, and they're not reaching anybody. and they have this Amish dress, and they are away from people. So they draw the line in silly places. On the other hand, we don't want to be liberal. We've seen what happens there too. What helps us decide how do we find the balance, the proper thing is the doctrine and proper application of the truth that we find in the Bible. You have to stay close to the Bible. These false teachers, getting back to them, are characterized in verse 10 through 11. Rebellious men, they don't want to toe the line, want to rebel against that. And that word rebellious literally means without order. They are throwing off teachings. Paul said, the things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, these also in turn commit to faithful men who will be able also to teach others. So if you're going to throw that off, assuming these men are teaching you correctly, then the whole thing collapses. So the rebellious men throw off the proper teaching. They are empty talkers. That word empty talkers literally means without fruit. I've heard people, especially politicians, they'll ask a question and they talk for a minute or two and you say, huh? What did they say? What did it mean? It was so mamby-pamby, no sense of conviction in there. And so people can't be for them or against them because what they say is just bleh. You don't want preachers like that either. You want preachers that forthrightly say what they believe, they communicate it. It's plain to everybody. It's not hot or cold. It's not lukewarm, and it's right down the pike. So you don't want empty talkers and deceivers, certainly not deceivers, especially those of the circumcision. Now, I want to give you some examples of this. Timothy, after he wrote the book of Titus, some years later he was arrested again and put in jail, and from jail, knowing that he was going to die, he wrote 2 Timothy, and he sent it to Timothy, and this is what he said in chapter 2 of verse 14. Remind them of these things and solemnly charge them in the presence of God not to wrangle about words, which is useless and leads to the ruin of the hearers. Word wrangling. Don't wrangle about words. You see this in courts. People are wrangling about words, and they try to reinterpret things to get a favorable conclusion for their client. And all they're doing is arguing one side or the other. They're not really interested in necessarily the truth. And so they're just trying to get a favorable outcome. My friends, there are people that are not concerned about what the words actually mean. They are concerned about a particular way in which they think. If you've ever talked to a Jehovah's witness, he'll wrangle about words. He'll say, well, it doesn't mean that way. As a matter of fact, I had a conversation with a pastor who had been a pastor here over 20 years, Mick Funderburg, and he's now a member of this church. He moved back up from the south, and he was talking about going to a Goodwill store, and the proprietor of this Goodwill store was a Jehovah's Witness, and he had a Jehovah's Witness Bible out there, and it was very cheap, and Pastor Mick Funderburg decided he would buy that Bible, and the man said, no, I'll just give that to you. And he said, do you know what it says in there? And Pastor Mick said, well, let's look and see. And he turned to a passage and he read it, and the man says, well, it doesn't mean that. He said, it doesn't. And he turned to another. Pastor Mick knows his Bible very well. And he read another passage and said, well, doesn't it mean this? And the fellow said, no, it doesn't mean that either. And he went to 3 or 4 other passages. And by the time he was done, the man had denied every one of those passages and the way Pastor Mick was interpreting it, which was the correct interpretation. And he said, well, this is interesting. Here is God, and he knows all things, and he certainly knows the language in which he's communicating. And he can't say it clearly enough for you and I to understand. That's curious. One of us is probably making a mistake. And so there are people who are word wranglers. I know how this works. You get into seminary and you take the Greek and the Hebrew and all this, and then you have this man who's been studying there for 3 years or so, and then he writes a paper, master's level paper, and then maybe they come back later and they'll write a doctoral level paper, and all these papers are then used as research to properly interpret the scriptures or improperly interpret the scriptures. And so there's this word wrangling, and if you're not careful, you can get romanticized by that. And you got to stay away from word wrangling, and rather you get into proper interpretation. So it goes on, and you have these think tanks that are false doctrine areas, false doctrine groups, and they do word wrangling, and they figure out how to reinterpret things so that their system can be protected. It goes on all the time. And it says here in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 14, I need to get over there, don't I? Not to wrangle about words, and then verse 15, be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth. You can inaccurately handle it, and it takes work to handle it accurately. But avoid worldly and empty chatter, or it will lead to further ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene. Friends, there are people that I know that maybe they have diabetes or something, and they get an infected toe and it doesn't heal. And they're trying to get it to heal, but it won't. And so what happens is they have to cut that toe off so that the others they can keep. But if they don't get that in time, then pretty soon the other toes have to come off, even the foot. I've seen men that have had to have it taken up to above their knee to save their body. And it seems like it's pretty drastic, and it is hurtful at the time. But if you don't do it, if you don't get rid of that infection, it's going to spread and kill the body. And to show that Paul is very serious about this, he names these 2 men. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, men who have gone astray from the truth, saying that the resurrection has already taken place, and they upset the faith of some. Well, they're teaching false doctrine about the resurrection. You want to get that right. And the Greeks had the idea that flesh was sinful, flesh was decaying, and only the spiritual was everlasting. And so when they talked about the resurrection, they were talking about spiritual resurrection and not bodily and spiritual resurrection. and they were upsetting the faith of people, and they were saying that already happened, or it isn't going to happen the way you think it has, and it got people upset. And he named them, and he told that they had to be basically ignored and put out of the church. So there's nothing fun about this stuff. It has to be done. Then 2 Timothy 4:4, there's another passage that states, it says here, I want to back up to verse 3, 2 Timothy 4:3. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, meaning the people, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth, and will turn aside to myths. And so, my friends, there are false teachers, and there's people who want to hear what they have to say. And they'll get rid of people that don't tell them what they want to hear, and they'll get people that they want to hear. It can happen two ways. They can get rid of their preacher and get one in that they like, that preaches mamby-pamby stuff, or they can leave that church and go to where somebody preaches mamby-pamby stuff. There's a whole lot of style over substance. People are looking for stylistic things. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily a bad thing, but there are some people that'll go because they have coffee a certain way, and they have music a certain way, and they have worship a certain way, and then they have a short sermon, and it's not too deep, and they have certain programs that they like. And all of these things in and of themselves are not necessarily bad, but if that's what you're looking for, when really you should be, I want sound food. I want the preaching of the word, and you don't get those things, then what you're going for is all style over substance. So be aware of that, my friends. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 4 has a statement. He says, nor to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies which give rise to mere speculation rather than furthering the administration of God which is by faith. But the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. For some men straying from these things have turned aside to fruitless discussion, wanting to be teachers of the law, even though they do not understand either what they are saying or the matters about which they are make confident assertions. So you have to be careful about all these things. And Titus 1, back to Titus, and we're looking at verse 14. It says, not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments of men who turn away from the truth. So that has to do with some things that were perhaps more pertinent to the first century place where they were fighting their battles. But the principle of dealing with false doctrine wherever it's at is the key here that I think we should be aware of. And the false doctrine where I was at when I was a young man was in the fundamentals, the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, the triunity of God, how you were saved, the second coming of Christ, the placement of the rapture. These are all the battles that I was going through. But now it's the homosexual agenda. It's whether the Bible is even something you should listen to. We got the internet and all of the false doctrines that are creeping in there. They have no accountability. They do some clickbait. You click on that and you listen to their false teaching, and you think because they seem semi-thorough that they know what they're talking about, and they don't. and there's no accountability. So, my friends, you need to get into a church where there's a man of God that's standing up there in the pulpit, and people with their Bibles are checking out what he's saying as he's preaching it. And you know this man's life. He's a moral man. You see his family. You can shake his hand. You can talk to him. You can see how he handles himself in everyday affairs. You live in the same community. That's the type of church you want to go to, where you have a man of God that you know that is faithful and moral. And he preaches the Word of God. So stay close to the Word. Stay very close to the Word. 2 Timothy 4, 1 and 2 has something to say here. I solemnly charge you, in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead by his appearing in his kingdom. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season to reprove, rebuke, exhort, and with great patience and instruction. So you just keep sharing it, and there's going to be times when people don't want to hear it. They are deceivers, and Jesus speaks of Pharisees this way. The Pharisees had gotten into the Jewish community, and they were false teachers. Oh boy. Matthew chapter 23, he has stern words. Matthew 23, for the Pharisees and the scribes. He says in Matthew 23:13, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from the people, for you do not enter in yourself, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. You're actually preventing people from going into the kingdom of heaven. It's kind of like a dog laying in a manger. There's the food for the cow. He won't eat it himself. The dog doesn't like that stuff. That's not what his food is. Cow comes up to eat, and the dog barks at him, and the cow can't eat. So he's a dog in a manger. These are dogs in a manger. They wouldn't go in themselves, and they'd try to prevent anybody else from believing so that they could get saved too. Look at verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte. Oh, look at the great missionary effort they're doing. Oh, the sacrifice that they're doing. They travel, and they found this one man that was willing to believe like they do. And you travel around for sea and land to make one proselyte. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Oh, this is tough stuff, friends. The Lord did not like these people. He said who they were. And of course, he says here in verse 24, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. So they look white, they look clean, but inside they're filthy. And you blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also. And it just goes on, all this stuff that he says about them. 7 or 8 verses more. And Jude, he has words about it. Jude was the half-brother of the Lord. And he has one chapter in his entire book. And he starts out here in verse 10, but these men revile the things which they do not understand, and the things which they know by instinct, like unreasoning animals. By these things they are destroyed. Woe to them, for they have gone the way of Cain. He was a rebellious man. And for pay they have rushed headlong into the error of Balaam. He was a false prophet. And perished in the rebellion of Korah, another rebellious man. 3 rebellious men. These are the men who are hidden reefs in your love feast when they feast with you without fear, caring for themselves. Clouds without water, defrauders. Oh, here comes the rain. Great. Mm-hmm. Carried along by winds, blown around wherever it takes them. Autumn trees without fruit. Doubly dead, uprooted, wild waves of the sea, casting up their own shame like foam, wandering stars for whom the black darkness has been reserved forever. So, my friends, he doesn't have anything nice to say about him either. O Lord, Paul, Jude, and we still have men like that today, and you have to be careful. So, how do you protect yourself from these things? Well, first of all, truth must be preached. Bring your Bibles. Check what is being said. If it doesn't ring true, you need to do a study. Protect yourself. You don't want to go to a doctor that's considered a quack because it might end up hurting you. And you have to protect yourself. And when it comes to hearing the preaching of the word, be careful who you're listening to. Secondly, revoke their right to teach. People who are teaching wrong should not be allowed to teach anymore in their church. And then holy living in the saints stops their foothold. If you people live right, and the teachers who teach false doctrine, they don't live right, they're going to show out. And you who are living right need to put them out. And my friends, what happens is that the church gets so carnal that to say, well, we can't discipline him because we're not any better than that. And so they say, we'll have to live with this. So the 3 things are, truth must be preached, revoke the right of these people to teach. Don't let them continue as pastors. Don't let them continue as Sunday school teachers. And thirdly, holy living. If the standards are high and these people are scallywags, they'll show out. And you need to remove them. Because chances are, if they're not doctrinally or morally straight, it's also because they're not doctrinally straight. They don't care about it. And so, my friends, be careful about the rebellious men. We're playing for keeps, and maybe you can survive, but the next generation, your children, your grandchildren, are the ones that are going to suffer, and that dog in the manger is going to keep them from going into heaven. You don't want that, friends. You do not want that. So be careful who you're listening to, and check your Bible. The fight is right at our doorstep. Please be careful.